The eruption of the plebs in the polis system occurred mostly from the 7th century to the 4th century BC. It began in the early Archaic period, when plebeians acquired the aforementioned economic, military, and religious relevance to start demanding access to the city's political and religious spheres. This eruption happened violently, which was the case of Syracuse, Eretria, Miletus, and other cities, or by concessions of the ruling class through legislators, like Solon in Athens, kings, like Servius in Rome, or popular tyrants, which was the case of Corinth with the tyrant Cypselus. The outcome was the same everywhere. The once inferior class of plebeians formally made their way into the city and subsequently dominated it. To illustrate the feeling the aristocrats of this period had towards the rise of the plebeian class, the archaic Greek poet Theognis of Megara recalls this period as a moment of great loss of tradition and morality, albeit with his own aristocratic bias and hatred for the democratic revolutions which may have affected him personally. He claims constantly that bad men, formerly without law or religion or tribunals or sacred meals, now mixed with the good men, the pious priestly class who possessed the hereditary religion. He claims that gods had been forsaken. True is that by the times of Theognis of Megara in the 6th century BC, nobility by birth had been weakened beyond repair and its former omnipotence became a fading memory. It was left with some aesthetics of displaying lineage and family tombs, but really nothing substantial. Theognis' poetry paints a very good image of these changing times, as Nietzsche said in his school thesis of 1864, commenting on Theognis of Megara. Theognis appears as a finely formed nobleman who has fallen on bad times, with the passion of a nobleman, such as his time loved, full of fatal hatred toward the upward striving masses, tossed about by a sad fate that wore him down and made him milder in many respects. He is a characteristic image of that old, ingenious, somewhat spoiled and no longer firmly rooted blood nobility, placed at the boundary of an old and a new era, a distorted Janus head, since what is past seems so beautiful and enviable, that which is coming seems disgusting and repulsive. A typical head for all those noble figures who represent the aristocracy prior to a popular revolution, and who struggle for the existence of the class of nobles as for their individual existence. By the end of the Plebeian Revolution, the city had gradually transformed, first by admitting the cadet branches as full citizens by allowing them to inherit, then by emancipating clients, and then by the eruption of plebs into the city, which was eventually dominated by these. The citizen count increased from a very limited number of paterfamilias to a much larger base, including younger brothers of the patrician class, former clients and plebs. The religious constitution of the early Western city-states, which instituted a caste system, was transformed into a distinctly Western plebeian city, which allowed citizenship rights, not relying on being born in a specific family, but granted to all those who formed part of the civic association, noble and commoner alike. Blood and religion lost their prominence to wealth and might. Theognis of Megara himself says this in his poetry. Among rams and asses and horses, Kyrnos, we look for those of noble breeding, and a man wants them to mate from worthy stock. Yet a nobleman does not mind marrying a base woman of base birth if she brings him money in abundance, nor does a woman shrink from becoming the wife of a base man with wealth. She prefers a rich husband to a worthy one. Money is what they honor. The noble weds a base man's daughter, the base a worthy man's. Wealth mixes stock. Thus do not be amazed, son of Polypaus, that the citizen's stock is growing feeble, for what is noble is being mixed with what is base. Let's examine deeply how this plebeian revolution happened in Athens. Now, after the overthrow of the Athenian kings came more than 5 centuries of aristocratic rule, the Archontate, which plebs and clients constantly resisted by making increasing attempts to enthrone a popular tyrant, succeeding with the installment of Solon in 612 BC. At the time, the population of Attica was generally divided in 3 large groups: the mountain people, the plains people, and the coast people. The mountain dwellers, or hillmen as Plutarch describes, and sea traders eventually forced the Athenian aristocratic class to make concession, and both sides agreed on instituting Solon as lawmaker. Solon seemed like a perfect choice. He came from an Eupatrid family, but was a trader by profession. He was commissioned to abolish the previous draconian laws and enact a new legal code that freed clients and released land from the Eupatrid religious grip. Solon, as we saw earlier, abolished clientship by removing the nexum and by tearing down the terminus, which destroyed the religious monopoly on the land, which had reserved property of the soil only to a small priestly class. By ending serfdom and freeing the land from the grip of religion, Solon created a new society in which birth didn't grant or deny any privilege. He gave de facto equality before the law to every Athenian, Eupatrid and plebeian alike. The latter could now own property, legally marry, become magistrates, and rule the city. This was a very similar thing to what the French Revolutionary Assemblée Nationale did with the 1789 abolition of feudalism, seigneurial rights, and church tithes. With legal equality, wealth and not birth became the main dividing aspect in social hierarchy. The new regime kept republican forms, but also some legacies of the previous caste system which benefited rich plebs, who became the new nobility by wealth. This system grew to be resented by poor plebs and Eupatrids alike. With the reforms of Solon done, the wealthy became the new aristocracy and the government deepened in its republican forms. However, in the changing tides of history, it was now the poor plebs who sought a tyrant to counter this new oligarchic government. And so came a new type of tyrant, as tyranny adapted from being a response to resist religious aristocracy to being a vehicle of the egalitarian pretensions of a newly rebranded popular party. Popular tyranny, also known as populism, was born. The Popular Party interpreted the resentment of poor plebs towards the oligarchs. In this new socio-political confrontation, the figure of Peisistratus, an Athenian politician related to Solon but with a more populist approach to the poor, appeared. By becoming the leader of the Popular Party and conducting an anti-aristocratic campaign, the masses of Athens supported Peisistratus in his proclamation as tyrant in 561 BC. Peisistratus wanted to preserve the recently conquered freedoms obtained with Solon's reforms by allegedly preventing the oligarchy in trying to abuse the system and create for themselves new privileges like those the old religious nobility had for themselves, thus reverting to a status of legal inequality. He, in fact, wanted to expand the extent of the reforms, where he thought Solon had come short. Peisistratus was a very popular ruler, twice being overthrown and twice being reinstated by the masses. He even installed a dynasty of tyrants supported by the Persian Empire. His son reigned after him, and only with a Spartan military intervention would his family's domination of Athens end in 510 BC. Peisistratus may sound familiar to certain 20th and 21st century populists. After the fall of Peisistratus' family from power, the old nobility had high hopes of restoring the old regime, but a new figure appeared in Athens in 508 BC, which would continue with the changes first introduced by Solon and deepened by Peisistratus: Cleisthenes. With Cleisthenes' reforms, the aristocratic religious constitution of the city would disappear and the caste system would be abolished. Cleisthenes did something truly revolutionary for his time. He rearranged the structure of society completely, previously organized in the Eupatrid clans, into 10 new tribes, each with its demos. These reforms achieved two main objectives. For one, they gave religion to all citizens, and, most importantly, the new tribes were not organized by birth into Eupatrid families, but were arranged simply on the basis on where people lived. This practically ended with any power the old nobility still had, because it broke the chains of the cult that privileged the Eupatrid and let the common folk worship the civic gods, the heroes or polia deities of the state. And, most importantly, people no longer worshipped physically in the Eupatrid's house, but in the vesta of their demos. A new social body was formed. Aristotle said that mixing men without caring for their ancestry was a primary cause for the apparition of the democratic system. By the end of Cleisthenes' reforms in 507 BC, Athens had completely abolished its religion constitution and became a new type of polity, founded in the legal equality of its citizens. Rome was a different story. Rome was an expansionist and more open society than Athens from its beginning, and it demanded a constant influx of people to sustain its conquests, the earliest being against the Latins, the Sabines, and the Etruscans. This brought in the elite nobility of the conquered peoples, who were assimilated by the Roman patricians as members of their own class. Everyone else was brought to Rome. Those who lacked religion or some sort of ancestral noble dignity were either absorbed as clients inside a gens or under the king's own familia, or were just relegated to being plebs. Plebs formed an alliance with the monarchy, just like they did in Greece with the tyrants, for mutual benefits. Kings wanted to weaken aristocratic power and strengthen centralization, whereas plebs supported kings to gain legal equality and access to positions of political power. King Servius made a series of reforms which dramatically changed the situation for the plebs. First, he gave them land, albeit outside the Ager Romanus, the land of Rome proper. He also founded new tribes by arranging people depending on their physical place of residence, giving gods to every quarter. Some of these quarters had their own Paganalia and Compitalia, which were festivals where all people participated as equals, grouping in the new tribes and not in the old patrician curiae. Servius promoted wealth as the mechanism for determination of power and hierarchy. He also reorganized the army by allowing all free citizens to be a part of it and grouped them into centuriata. The Roman army structure didn't dissolve in peacetime, and 25 years after Servius, it had become a political assembly, which we have mentioned before, the centuriate assembly, in Latin comitia centuriata, in which patrician and plebeian seated for the first time in the same political body as equals. Years later, the overthrow of kings put a momentary end to the rise of plebs, and only the institution of the comitia centuriata was maintained because of its practical military use, but the aristocracy stripped the plebs of all other civil and religious rights. They were even cast away from the lands given by Servius. Plebs were effectively, again, excluded from the city, and as a way of incorporating them, patricians attempted to convert them into clients by making them slaves of debt through the nexum, to which plebs tried to resist with legal protection in contracts. Not paying a debt would make a man an addictus, meaning effectively a slave. Had this system prevailed, the Roman city would have persisted as an association of the patres of the gens as the only real citizens, while everyone else would have been distributed as clients inside an aristocratic familia. Unlike the weaker eupatridae of Athens, the Roman patricians firmly refused to make any concessions on legal equality and insisted on making plebeians their clients through the hated nexum. In the sight of the continued patrician desire to make them slaves, the famous legend recalled by the Roman historian Titus Livius said that the plebs simply decided to abandon Rome and went to Mons Sacer in what has become a very well-known episode of Roman history during the so-called conflict of the orders. Some patricians soon realized that without plebs, Rome would be severely weakened militarily, and its future glory and present existence would come into question. The plebs instead realized that they had no political or religious structure because they all derived from the patrician religion and its constitutional legitimacy. Patricians and plebeians both needed each other. They needed a compromise that would allow them to live together. Even with the need of compromise, the nobility didn't merge the patrician and plebeian cities in full equality before the law with the strike of the pen of a lawmaker, as it had happened in Athens. Instead, it gave an apparently minor concession and agreed that some plebeians could have the status of being untouchable by the city's law. Plebs agreed, and the figure of the tribune of the plebs was born. This tribune was not a true magistrate, because its title didn't originate from religion, but from social pact. Tribunes were considered almost like a sacred figure, a walking vesta which offered shelter to all plebs. They didn't have any political power in the beginning, but it started to pave the way for more changes to come. With the existence of tribunes, two distinct societies coexisted in Rome: the patrician city, based on religion and grouped in curiae, and the plebeian city, appealing to practicality and nature in its norms, grouped in tribes. They had two different sets of institutions. Only plebeians could become tribunes, whereas only patricians could be magistrates and consuls. This duality deepened to the point of violent confrontation in the streets of Rome. The gap between the patrician and plebeian orders gradually started to diminish. The military reforms of Servius were kept intact because they served a very practical purpose. They reinforced Roman military power. Thanks to this, the militarily comitia centuriata became the neutral ground between the patrician assembly of curiae and the plebeian assembly of tribes, the only assembly where both orders came together to discuss issues that involved the whole city. It is remarkable how the republican tradition of Rome largely derived from the military organization of its army, which mixed all social orders. This was mainly kept because the need of patricians and rich plebs alike to preserve their city, in which both were invested, and to expand Roman conquests and harvest the spoils of war. Unlike the Athenian nobility, wealth had been cultivated by the Roman patricians through agriculture, industry, and trade, and they associated with rich plebeians. Wealthy patricians began to understand the desires of rich plebs and to question their own religious privileges. Rich plebeians wanted to have a common law which treated them equally so they could compete with any patrician and obtain the privileges restricted to the nobles. These rich plebs used their connections to promote their agenda of equality before the law. With equal laws, their power would rise to new heights as money became the true symbol of power at the expense of religion. The first milestone in obtaining a common law for all was acquiring full equality in private law. The Roman plebs continually pressured for a common legal code, and patricians reluctantly finally conceded to the writing of this code in 455 BC. It was written by a commission of patricians known as the Decemviri, but subject to the approval of all social classes. And so, in 450 BC, we get the writing of the legal code of the 12 Tables, which was then approved by the Comitia Centuriata and publicly exposed in the Forum for all to see, a sharp contrast with the annals and the religious laws that were kept in secret by the priests. These codes, written by the Decemviri, eventually had to admit plebeian legislators, and they revolutionized Roman law by proclaiming equality of all classes and allowing plebeians and patricians to live under a single law without any distinction, allowing them to intermarry, own property, and all cases now went to the same tribunals. Because of the universal character of civil law affecting all people, equality in civil law was the hardest milestone to conquer and probably took longer. Of course, some patricians resisted these attempts of a democratization of law and considered these as a threat to their religious principles, but the incentives were leaning towards allying with the plebs instead of confronting them. Titus Livius, in his History of Rome, speaks about how the two orders of patricians and plebs were intermarrying in the 4th century BC, after the abolition of the prohibition of marriage and mixing of blood between classes. Marcus Fubius Ambustus, a patrician, possessed great influence amongst the men of his own order, and also with the plebeians, because they felt that he did not in any way look down on them. His two daughters were married, the elder one to Sulpicius, the younger to Licinius Stollo, a distinguished man but a plebeian. The fact that Fabius did not regard this alliance as beneath him made him very popular with the masses. Things were changing in Rome, and they were changing fast. Conquering equality in private law was a springboard for plebs to attempt control of the highest political offices, including consulship. This struggle was done with more patience and calm than obtaining the tribunate or the common legal code of the Decemvirs, and was mostly advanced by the plebeian elite, the ones who could actually aspire to these positions. It seems that in the 4th century BC, the tribunes of the plebs, Licinius and Sextus, convinced the plebeian masses to support their aspirations to consulship by promising debt relief and land distribution. Titus Livius says that the Senate took 10 years to finally give in to these plebeian demands, also known as the Licinian rogations, and the senatorial approval was possibly hastened by pressure of violent plebeian uprising inside the city of Rome in the 360s BC. The Comitia finally met, and the Senate approved their proposals in what became known as Lex Licinia Sextia. In 366 BC, Lucius Sextius Lateranus became the first plebeian consul of Rome, as Titus Livius describes in his History of Rome. Lucius Sextius was the first consul to be elected out of the plebs. By the 350s BC, plebs had equality in civil law and access to the highest political positions. Conquering religion was next on the list. Plebs already had a sense of belonging to a religious tradition by having their own gods of their streets and tribes. The plebeian religion had been formed for the use of the commoners outside of the patrician custom, but since political positions were already religious figures anyway, it was convened by the late 4th century BC that half of augurs and pontiffs would be chosen by the plebs. Throughout the development of this Roman conflict of the orders in which the patrician nobility clashed with the rest of the Roman populace, plebs had conquered full equality and had risen to the highest political and religious offices. The power of the old patrician religion was broken, and the principles that had constituted the city as a union of aristocratic clans with a social system of castes were extinguished. The plebeian revolutions in Greece and Italy transformed the ancient West beyond measure. The hereditary religion lingered on as a mere shadow of its former self, a set of external, often meaningless forms. The domination of the religious nobility was now a fading memory, and with that, the vivid reality of the new plebeian city, brought upon by a new constitution of society, inaugurated a new era of conflicting dialectics in which different belief systems, institutions, and forms of government collided. Things were about to warm up even more. Feel free to donate to this channel's Patreon to support the making of these videos. We will receive any donation from our patrons and sponsors with plenty of gratefulness, as it truly aids with our enterprise of popularizing historical and philosophical topics to reinvigorate the study of the Western tradition. We also invite you to leave a comment below and like and share if you enjoyed it. Stay tuned and subscribe.